presenters today. We're going to do, each person will talk, we'll do the talks back to back, and then we'll come back all together for a panel discussion. So do add your thoughts and comments and questions as we progress through. So the first speakers are the curators of Machine Wilderness, Alice Smits and Theun Karelse. And Alice is a founder and artistic director of Zone 2 Source, which is a platform for art, nature and technology in the Amstel Park in Amsterdam, where international artists are invited for regular exhibitions, talks, workshops and excursions in which new imaginations on nature-culture relations are being developed in the park's pavilion and in the outdoor spaces around the pavilion. Working together with Theun, she's also organising longer-term transdisciplinary collaborative research programmes such as Machine Wilderness, which is currently hosting a series of artist residencies at Artist Zoo in Amsterdam. And we will also be joined by Theun Karelse from Theun, who is, and Theun is a distributed group of transdisciplinary laboratories operating at the interstices of art, science, nature and everyday life. So his interests and experimental practice explore the edges between art, environment, technology and archaeology through field experimentation. So we'll hear from Alice first and then Theun. So welcome, Alice, over to you.
Hi, thank you for being here. Thanks for inviting me for this event. I'm going to try to share my screen. It's still being shared. It says that I cannot start it yet. Okay, so you have to unshare, Heather. You need to stop sharing your screen so I can share.
Yes, that is the CSM innovation. Please stop screen sharing so that Alice can share.
Okay, there I am.
Okay, great.
Okay, you can see my screen?
Yes, that's all good.
Okay, great. Happy to start in a good way. See, my first screen is a bit off, but okay, so yes, yeah, so great. Thanks for being here and good evening, everybody. This presentation we're doing together with Theun Karelse, who is my collaborator and partner in crime in Machine Wilderness. This is a program that we're currently doing with 8 artists in residence at the zoo in Amsterdam, at Artist Zoo. Heather is one of them. So we're very happy you're invited us to share our approaches here. I'm going to give in 10 very quick minutes a little bit of an overview of Machine Wilderness, which really is a program that has been going on for several years. And as part of my collaboration, my curatorial practice at Zone 2 Source, in collaboration with Theun's research on Machine Wilderness as an artist and researcher.
Alice, sorry to interrupt. I think we're missing a little bit of your screen. I can only see some of the text.
I think it's just the first slide, something went wrong there, I think. This is Machine Wilderness and our names, but
okay. Carry on. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay, so I made some mistake there. Sorry about that. So this is my second slide. This is Zone 2 Source is a platform art podium for art, nature and technology that in the Amstel Park. In Amsterdam, and it's the Amstel Park is a quite specific park. It was designed in 1972 as a world exhibition for horticulture, and we're using it for all its specific characteristics, like the pavilions. I quickly lead you through this to kind of show you where we are. These are offices and a place for workshop. We have the glass house where we are curating our exhibitions. We have the orangery that we're using from spring to fall, where we really invite artists that are working on the park itself, looking into the plants, also looking into the gardens, the gardeners, caretakers, thinking often about what a park can be. What can be a park in times of ecological crisis, as a place where we encounter other species. So this is really a specific curatorial practice, as I will show, where we use the park kind of as our laboratorium, as a field site in which we are testing and experimenting. and inviting artists to present and create new works around art, nature, and technology. Recently, we got a garden, which I'm extremely happy with. We started this 2 months ago. We got access from the municipality to this. You don't see it very well, but this is a garden behind those walls. It was originally a Belgian contribution to the World Expo, the Floriade. And so we developed it now as an artist garden, where we're thinking together with a collective of artists who work around cultural practices around plants and speculated taxonomies and how this influences our practice of gardening. So I want to show you some of the works that we've been doing together with artists that are now participating in Machine Wilderness. This first show with Ivan Henriquez was in 2014 when I just started Zone to Source, and was quite instrumental actually for my way of thinking about curating in the realm of technology, biology, living systems. Ivan is an artist that works often together with scientists, and this particular project, Symbiotic Machine, was developed with Free University. And what we did, we used a glass house and we built a big pond there, where you see them building it inside of the pavilion. Ivan was working in the ponds of the park and elsewhere to get algae, and the algae were distributed inside of this pond. So the Symbiotic Machine is a robotic, environmental robotics experiment that is swimming in this pool for a period of 2 months. Is finding the algae, is actually consuming the algae, swimming through the light, and through photosynthesis, algae are photosynthetic organisms, it's gaining again the energy to continue moving around. And this was a project that very much demonstrates a kind of curatorial practice in which we have artists not only presenting their work, but also experimenting and researching. And so this was for 2 months long. We were a site where we had a lot of workshop and people coming in, students and scientists, but also children and general public, as well as experts that were working together with Ivan and his team on thinking and experimenting with robotic systems and technology inside of environments. And the question that Ivan is working on is really looking at how these how our machines actually function inside environments, inside of our landscape, and how they can create more symbiotic relationships, especially when it comes to energy, the way they generate energy. And so through working together with people and with visitors, all these dialogues are starting up and thinking together with people. And this is a project that Ivan, after this, won a prize at Ars Electronica, and it's been showing around the world after that. But nobody ever, as Ivan told me, ever showed it in this specific way. It was always showed in exhibition, hanging on a ceiling with a video of the project here at Zone to Source and a text about it, which would be a way that I would never actually show this kind of work. And it was really, for me, very profound to think that this is actually quite unique to offer this kind of spaces to artists, and further kind of strengthened my thinking about curating these kind of experiments. And I'm really interested in bringing artistic research in a public park, in a public site, where research, it becomes shared exploration together with people. So I'd show you one other artist, Spela Petric. She is actually a trained biologist that is working in the field of bioarts. She's also participating in the artist residency program that I will show you later. This is a project, Ectogenesis Plant Human Monsters, in which she also turned the glasshouse into a laboratorium. This is an experiment that is trying to create a hybrid of humans and plants through her own sex hormones. And interrogating into the developments of biotechnology, but at the same time, because also questioning that our technology always takes human or the human brain as an example, but maybe plants are actually a lot more successful in surviving than humans are. So should we not also think about plant life as maybe being a better example for our technologies? So these are all these questions raised with it. We had several days where Spela was in the space, actually working in our laboratory together with people who were donating their urine for these experiments, having discussions. And then we recently have started another project I want to quickly mention. This is the School for Multi-Species Knowledges. We launched it last year, and it's going on right now in the Amster Park. And there has been also a long ambition to want to create a workspace together with people over several weeks and months, in which we're looking into what it actually means, what we're talking about. If we talk about multi-species community, what kind of tactics, what kind of tools do we need, what kind of practices belong to that. So a lot of this work is really about how we think about theoretical concepts and how we can make them transformative into practice. Again, this is Pela Patrick's here on the right side. Was looking into tools and how we can retool the tools we usually use for gardening and retool them to create different kind of technologies and different kind of relationships to the organisms that we are encountering. And in this school, we have now 20 participants who now for 6 weeks are working in the park, inviting guests to share tactics and develop different kind of languages around it, etc. So the park really is our whole laboratory for this. Machine Wilderness exhibition in the Amster Park. I show you Ian Ingram, who is now coming to Artis as well. And this again was an exhibition where we had the artists exhibit their work on robotics, but also at the same time work, as you see here at Ian. And so visitors would encounter him, discuss his project that he's working on. This had Dries and Verstappen with a spotter that was spotting birds and artificial intelligence that is dreaming of nature, and has now also spent 2 weeks in Artis recently. That's but a really project that started in this edition. This is one of the outputs of the AI, the spotter. Ian Ingram did a lot of workshops also in the park. Here you see his danger squirrel, Nutkin. It's a robotic device that is trying to communicate with other animals through signals. And he did a workshop here with children, but you can see how he's also experimenting outside and how people get into communications about this and really create the space to relate to humans and non-humans in the park. We did Machine Wilderness in the Digital Design Weekend in London. Here's Ian together with Matthew, who's an ecologist we invited. We spent a whole weekend there talking to people. We had one of his robotics in the tree. This is Machine Wilderness program at Theun in Cornwall, where we were working in this specific landscape that you're seeing there. And again, this is an example where we really want to be out on the fields, doing field work with artists, encountering scientists and engineers and designers. And the main question of Machine Wilderness is really thinking about how we design our technologies and what is the role of our machines and technology in our landscape. So the question we had over a 2-day speculative workshop was, first of all, how can our technology live in there before we start thinking what it's actually going to do there? So instead of looking into functions, we want to first see how it can create symbiotic relationship to our environment. And so we did all these experiments. It was a workshop that Ivan Henriquez that we brought to Cornwall where he was working with people on the idea how you can get energy out of this particular environment. And here you see we had a very low budget output that was actually launched and seeing how the ties might work to gain energy for this specifically model. We also went with artists. We brought them into other kinds of landscape. Here's Ian Ingram and Arsbio Arctica in Kilpisjärvi in Finland, where he spent together with Antti and Theun several weeks experimenting in the Arctic. And then we come to our very first time when we launched Machine Wilderness. We were thinking about what kind of place we would actually want to launch this program. And then we just heard a lecture from a professor at Artis who was really talking about the zoo that started a long time ago, 150 years ago in Amsterdam, as a place, not only as a zoo, but a place for nature, technology and science, and that they kind of try to bring back through different kinds of musea and presentations and scientific exploration. So we thought this is really the great place actually to launch Machine Wilderness as a program. So that was 2015. Ever since we talked with them about presenting artists doing research for several weeks inside of the zoo We were supposed to launch and begin in April 2020, and I think you all know what happened then. So we made several versions, but finally started in March 22. So the program is now ongoing, and this was one of the first times that we brought the artists together with Thijs, who's a zoo designer, to start exploring the zoo. And that's is my very last slide. So I want to bring it now to Theun, who's going to show you the artists and their particular research in the zoo.
Thank you, Alice.
Thank you.
Theun, are you happy to share?
Yeah. Hello, everybody. I'm just grabbing my screen and share. No, that's the wrong button. Review slideshow. Thank you for inviting us. And so Alice gave sort of the run-up to the current program at the zoo. We've worked in many different landscapes, and in a way, this curation we're talking about is not just about inviting participants, but it's also deciding where to go and what the scene is, and who is part of the conversation. So Machine Wilderness aims to not work in a controlled laboratory, but to work in the presence of other beings. So in a way, it's going to places where your control is limited. You can curate some of the things, but many things you cannot. And when you work in sort of wild places, in the Finnish mountains or something, what's challenging is, there are many challenges, but one of the main challenges is that the animals you might want to interact with may be hiding, or there's no audience, or it takes a long time to get there, and so you have to pack really well. And over the years, we've sort of gained experience in that, and you start to see, okay, a great participant in a field experiment is someone who has certain skills, and bringing that to the zoo is actually quite different, because audience is massive in a zoo, animals are close by, so some of the problems that we sort of encounter in landscape are less evident in zoos. Here are Maria and Erwin carrying around their spotter. They sort of kicked off the program at the zoo. The spotter is a camera that sort of tries to learn what animals and their environment look like, and then build its own images from what it sees. So visiting the steenbokken, the alpine mountain goats. Here's Erwin setting the system up. And then once it's running, you know, you can read the newspaper and the machine takes over the process. They place their project of a machine looking at animals in an environment in the tradition of artists working at zoos, drawing from observation. So here's the machine looking at some baboons, and what they noticed is you become a very different zoo visitor, because you stay at specific places for several days, not just a few minutes. So they observed quite specific behavior, like these giraffes like to lick the roof for some reason. And this is the type of image that comes out. You might hazard a guess of what type of animal this is. It's a meerkat. This is how it sort of spots it. And Heather was also part of also started her residency in the zoo. Here she's sort of setting up an ant observatorium, moving it out into a place where there are ants just next to the gorillas. So really close to both ants and gorillas. And then there's these massive gorillas, and Heather is focusing on those inconspicuous little ants, trying to entice people to listen to them and see them and spot them, see their behavior, draw their behavior. Antti Tenets from Finland is also part of the residency. Here you see him moving through the Finnish landscape, and Antti works a lot with wild animals like birds of prey, wolves, the salmon in the rivers. This is a portrait he made of wolves in their natural environment. And here he is in the zoo, very different. The pack of wolves is only 2 wolves in a small space relatively. So he brought some night cameras and we started to see their nightlife. This is a wolf at night, and it turns out that they hunt rats at night. He's interested in sort of, through AI, combining animals into these sort of animals like griffins and these fantastical beings. Ivan Henriquez is originally from Brazil, and here he's visiting the rainforest, looking at lichen as a composite being, talking about symbiosis, different kinds of symbiosis in the zoo, and trying to make small experiments with several different kinds of organisms in a small space to see what happens, what's that dialogue like, which kinds of languages are in soil. Talking to researchers about it, looking at very small scales. And Thomas Thwaites is currently working in the zoo on a harmless car. And so we first visited an expert in making old-fashioned wooden cars, like these wagons, trying to figure out, okay, how would you make a harmless car? So his ambition is to make a car that is harmless to all forms of life. It's a bit like in Jainism, you have this sort of idea that people wear little masks or have really soft shoes so they don't step on ants or they don't breathe in flies. You know, it's that kind of impossible mission. This is calculating the kinds of stresses in the car, and this is the material starting to weave. First car. So people are working in the zoo, and we'll end in this new museum with a day of showing end results, and Heather will also return. That's my presentation.
Fantastic. Thank you, Theun and Alice, for sharing the artistic research and experimental systems that you have at play in the park and the zoo. We'll come back and talk about that in more detail later on. So people watching, if you have questions and comments, please put them in the chat and we'll bring them into the discussion later on. Our next speaker is Magdalena Tyżlik-Carver, and she is Associate Professor in Digital Communication and Culture at the Department of Digital Design and Information Studies at Aarhus University. Magdalena is an independent curator and researcher investigating relational arrangements of humans and non-humans and their biopolitical creations through post-human curating, future thinking, data fictions, and datafications. She produces curatorial experiments with software, with people, with machines and data, and investigates forms of data curating. A recent curatorial project includes the exhibition Fermenting Data, which is going to be the focus, I think, of your talk this evening. So welcome, Magdalena. Over to you.
Thank you. I will try to share my screen now. Yeah?
Yep, that's all working.
Great, thank you. Yes, thank you for this invitation to join this curatorial roundtable and to share my recent research and curatorial project, Fermenting Data. It is an ongoing project which I initiated in 2020, just before pandemic, but together with the co-curator Anders Visti, who I collaborated on this project with, we managed to produce quite a few things: exhibition, 2 artistic commissions, artist residency, a publication, performances, a website, workshops, and also public events. So it's a quite a big project, and I will not be able to introduce all of its elements here in the time that we have. So in the next 20 minutes of this presentation, I want to focus on kind of background for the project and talking a little bit about a research framework. And also I will talk about 2 artistic commissions that were created for the project. Okay, great. So Fermenting Data, like many of my previous curatorial projects, are driven by my research within the field of software studies and critical data studies, new materialism, post-human theories, and feminist practices. And broadly speaking, I am interested in how software and data are a mode, material, and a practice for artistic production, but also for curatorial production. And I'm interested in how they, software data and various kind of algorithmic and data models are materials that undergird much of contemporary life. And I'm looking into how artists and curators intervene into dominant models and introduce other ways of working with data. And fermenting data is part of this body of work. So, as I mentioned, in the case of Fermenting Data, I collaborated with Anders Visti, who's Aarhus-based artist, who curated with me an exhibition and workshops and a number of other things. And together, we also collaborated with the 3 artist-run spaces in Aarhus, Andromeda, Sigrid Stur, in Gellerup, and also Spanien 19C, where workshops or some elements of the project took place. Workshops, exhibition, and so on. And these images are from these different events that were happening there and that were part of Fermenting Data. So just to give you a background of Fermenting Data, it's a project that speculates on data forms and practices and speculates on how to make space for different data practices. And these are 2 major leading questions for Fermenting Data. And indeed, they're very practical. So how to reclaim data as common practice, that is, as a practice that is accessible beyond the disciplines of computer science and data science, and how to reclaim data from common narratives and ideas that are mainly propagated by big tech, but not only. Commonly used terms in relation to data are extraction, exploitation, and surveillance. So these are kind of also the dominant narratives that have colonized much of what is said about data, but also what is done with data and how we practice data, how we make data. So the very fact that data from early on has been defined as oil or water or air suggests certain ideas about data that lead to or supposedly explain this kind of the narrative where data are natural resource that can be extracted. And while this narrative is widely accepted and functions as a way to explain this largely abstract phenomenon that are data, it also completely undermines and actually hides the very simple fact that data are not a natural resource, and that in order to have data, they have to be made into data, right? So data comes from somewhere, and it has some source from which it comes. And in the highly networked world, data are results of complex relations, which also require accounting for and recognizing them for what they are. So Fermenting Data is a speculative project that invites to imagine, discover, invent data practices that work with different metaphors. So symbiosis rather than exploitation, collaboration and not extraction, consent and not surveillance, but also refusal, so the possibility to say no, to withdraw collaboration and participation at any time, and uncertainty brought by the fact that there is wide range of agencies present in data practices that include human agencies, but also non-human agencies, such as data and algorithms, platforms, and related, and more than humans, such as microbes and other living and non-living bodies. So what if data could be fermented? And it is a speculative question that follows a hypothesis that it is possible to ferment data, right? And it's a wild assumption, but one that takes seriously materiality of data. So the project Fermenting Data engages materiality of data to inquire into how data take part in making of this world, not virtually only, not just as part of information and communication systems, not only as part of knowledge-making sciences, but as a vibrant element. Data are made and they make. So once we take this assumption that data are material, it is then also possible to see into data properties. The materiality of data is a complex problem, and one way to visualize this complexity could be in this image, or actually a series of images of a Pluto taken by NASA over a period of 25 or so years. And if we look at the two images, the very first image and the last image of Pluto, a planet which actually is no longer a planet, but there is obvious difference in these images, and specifically that's a difference in the quality of this image. So one is pixelated and the other is kind of high resolution image, where it is even possible to see the surface of and the detail of the surface. So this, of course, points to advanced tools that are used here, not only involve computational powers, but also the, in this case, ability to get closer to the planet, right? So the image on the left is taken with Hubble Space Telescope, which is a telescope that orbits our planet, so it's quite far from Pluto. And the other image is a NASA Space Horizon spacecraft, which is a mission to get a lot of information and data about Pluto. And in 2015, actually not in 2019, when this image was taken, it was the closest that it managed to get to the planet. So what we see in this image is not actually all that defines the image, right? So here data has to be captured. The quality of it is very much dependent on the processes and tools used in capturing data. Much can be said about this, of course, but it suffices to say that data are simply not naturally occurring phenomena that can be harvested, but in fact, they are dependent on measuring devices and methods that can generate information by capturing data. So they process, visualized, transferred, stored, archived, and displayed, and so on. And data properties are dependent on these variables. The fact that these data exist is because of the infrastructures that support making of this data. And it's important to think about that also when fermenting data and when in a project where we speculate on data as matter, as a thing, or actually many things, right? Because data is always plural, is never just one data point that defines the value of data, but many, right? So we talk about big data. And fermentation here becomes this kind of speculative device with which to think of data as a material and to query where the value of this data lies. So perhaps I just quickly talk about fermentation now. Fermentation is a process of food preservation that involves practices of gathering vegetables, if that's what we want to ferment, and we usually ferment cabbages in fermenting data, and preparing them, so chopping, salting, massaging, sort of waiting for the cabbage to release the juices, packing them in jars, submerging, leaving them to ferment. And in this process, vegetable matter undergoes fermentation, so cabbage becomes sauerkraut. Plant matter, enzymes, microbes are in a process of becoming, right? Because and change, because fermentation is a process of transformation where these different bodies seep through each other and they become together. And in fermentation, this becoming together is a chemical process of releasing energy from carbohydrates in an anaerobic environment. So there is no oxygen present. Microbes in this process feed on sugar and starch, and they generate CO2, alcohol, and lactic acid. So some consider fermentation to be a controlled decay, or because it is a metabolic process. It's bacterial poo, as some also say. So according to Lynn Margulies, fermentation is one of the life's essential miniaturized chemical systems invented by bacteria. And together with photosynthesis, oxygen breathing, and removal of nitrogen from air, these inventions, according to Margulies, has not been matched by anything that humans came up with. And in their analysis of various forms of life on this planet, Margulies and Sagan in their work consider symbiosis as a major power on Earth, fueling change and promoting collaboration between organisms. So especially exciting is this idea of symbiotic alliance, which becomes permanent, kind of creating organisms that, as they say, are not simply the sum of their parts, but something more like the sum of all possible combinations of their parts. And so this symbiotic alliance is a really exciting provocation that challenges us in thinking in the project of data practices as nourishing our lives and those of others touched by data. So I'm going to talk about the two artistic commissions now for fermenting data, where artists were invited to interpret fermenting data through their practice. So a kind of beautiful intervention into thinking through these relations between bodies as a collective alliance of cells and environments that are rich in carbon and hydrogen and many other elements is the work Stagnant Time by Danish artists based in the Netherlands, Sissel Mariton, who we commissioned for this project. And it's actually really exciting to be talking about Sissel because I was introduced to Sissel's work and Jonathan's work at Zone to Source a number of years ago that Alice and Theun organized. So it's great to have this kind of circle today. Sissel in her work explores relation between humans and their environment as a kind of entanglement, which starts with the question, where do we perceive our bodies to end and the environment to begin? So for this commission, Sissel developed a 3-channel video installation, which is a story told by 3 bog bodies, which were never found by peat diggers. So they tell the story of kind of becoming in the bog and with the bog. So bog bodies are ancient bodies found, mummified bodies found in peat areas in Northern Europe in particular. And one such body was found near Aarhus, where I am based, where this project is based. And it's also, the body is now exhibited in a museum in the city. And 3 bodies, 1 female and 2 female and 1 male were also found and are in Drent's Museum in the Netherlands. And these 4 bodies are the source of Sissel's story and also source of her data. So the dominant theory for the bodies is that they were outcasts who were killed and then buried in bogs of Northern Europe. The fact that they had violent wounds so often supported this theory. But there are also other theories that suggest that they were sacrificial, so we don't really know why these bodies ended up in bogs. But what is interesting about them, and that's also what Sissel works with in here, is that bogs provide an environment which preserves the bodies and gives us information about them. So basically, bog is an anaerobic environment. Bogs have stagnant water, which does not support oxygen to enter it. And sphagnum, which is released by dying sphagnum moss, is a simple sugar compound on which microorganisms feed, degrading peat moss into humic acid. And this creates this unique chemical ecology that kind of mummifies soft tissue and preserves the body. So it was even possible to know what the grog woman that was found near Aarhus ate for breakfast the day that that person died. So sphagnum time is performed through this kind of humming and chanting, and offers a kind of a mediation on time and changing environment. And as Sissel says, it's a mediation on life and post-life cycles entangled with sphagnum ecosystem. And what you see here is a kind of how it was installed, and also the three screens from stills from the video. So Sissel generates this narrative with different techniques. She uses photogrammetry to collect data from photographs of bodies. She uses game engine to map these scans into a virtual environment. There is also sound composition, and it's performed by two performers. And so the story is created that attempts to show us the complexity of the body and the difficulty to think of it as an individual organism. And the question of how these scans of bodies will be used, how this data would be processed and visualized, was also of a great concern and interest to the curators of the bodies in the museum, and Drent's Museum, who had many conversations with the artists to make sure that this data, and by extension, the bodies, are treated well in this work. So to me, this is really interesting and points to something very important, that the relation between the body as the source of data and the data as an abstract representation of the body requires a continuous care, right? It's highly curated and cared for by curators and the artist, and that care for data-body relation is part of the project too. And each of the commissioned projects engages collecting information. Data is collected to bring them all into a format that is quite poetic and visualizes or sonifies data in a very different way to InfoVis or similar techniques of visualization, data visualization. So here the process is important and is part of the practice and desire to capture and to show affective dimensions that are present in data. So data not just as a number, but as a number in relation to its source and in need to care for that link. So this affective element is part of the work of Anders Visti, who, as I mentioned, was a co-curator of this project, but was also commissioned to produce this work. And Anders created this instrument, Aarhus Urban Operating System, which allows for a live mixing and live coding of data that he collected for the project and then performed in a series of events in theatre in Gellerup in Aarhus. And this is also quite a complex work because it engages a number of different technical elements, but also because it is situated in a very charged social context of the so-called ghetto laws in Denmark. I'm not sure how familiar you might be with this, but ghetto areas in Denmark are areas that are defined as particularly vulnerable public housing areas, where quite often majority of population are non-Western. And since 2010, annual ghetto lists were published until only last year, where I think they were stopped because they were challenged by inhabitants and other groups who feel that they are affected by the racist laws and treated unfairly. So Gellerup, where part of the Fermenting Data exhibition took place, and also where the first Fermenting Data workshops took place in 2020, is a ghetto area and has been for the last 10 years. And in that time, it has been undergoing a major change that is architectural. So some buildings are destroyed and new are created, and also social, because quite many families and people living there are being rehoused to new locations in order to change the social and ethnic fabric of the area. So we were introduced to these issues during the workshops by Aisha Amin, curator of Andromeda, and also by Grete Ogard, the curator of Sigrid's 2. And this encounter prompted Anders and I to develop this exhibition to focus on the city and the idea of a smart city, and to show this narrative differently. And also it influenced Anders to create Aarhus Urban Operating System as his contribution to Fermenting Data project. So working on this commission, Anders was also creating a database, a recording of conversations and interviews with people in the area, as well as recording of sounds from their homes and from the area. And what you can see on the screen is the database that is a map, and where different recordings or different sounds are included, and there is an index of one of such audio recordings. So this graph is also an API, application programming interface, that can be queried from the sequencer. So if you can see here, it's operated live during the performance and connects with this different data and generates this live kind of composition. Another data set was also used to train here recurring neural network, and that's the screen second right. Here development plans for the area and minutes from meetings were used to generate the kind of absurd statements, which are then read in Danish with Google text-to-speech software. So this work is performed. And as it is performed, it kind of is a sonified and visual record of the loss and grief that results from these processes of restructuring of this area that are rarely captured in the view and in the new visions of smart cities. So I guess, well, as I said, the project is ongoing, and the exhibition, as well as presenting these two commissions, included a number of other elements. But I think my time's up, so I'll finish sharing, and we can maybe talk about things later during the conversation. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Magdalena. I can already see really interesting kind of synergies around mediation and transformation coming between the different talks. So our third speakers tonight are from Art Laboratory Berlin, Christian Deluxe and Tuçe Erel. And Art Laboratory Berlin was founded in 2006 by an international team of art historians and artists, including Regina Rapp and Christian Deluxe. The laboratory's main goal is the presentation and mediation of contemporary art at the interface of art, science and technology. Christian Deluxe is a curator and visual artist whose curatorial work focuses on the interface of art, science and technology in the 21st century, with special interest given to bioart, DIY science initiatives and facilitating collaborations between artists and scientists. And Tuçe Erel is a team member of Art Laboratory Berlin, and has been since December 2019, and her curatorial interests are archiving practices, posthumanism, Anthropocene and eco-criticism. And they're working together currently on a project entitled Hackers, Makers and Thinkers, and I think that's what you're going to be talking about tonight. So over to you, Tuçe and Chris.
Hi, good evening. Okay, I guess Tuçe, do you want to just, yeah. So Art Laboratory Berlin, as Heather said, is basically our main goal is the presentation and mediation of contemporary art at the interface of art, science, and technology, with a concentration in the last years of life sciences and research. We have our kind of modes of practice, so exhibitions, so sustainable discoursive curatorial practice, meaning long-term collaboration with artists. Instead of subordinating the artworks on exhibition to theory, we're interested in an inductive approach that rather places the artistic work and process at the center of inquiry. We're interested in artistic research and arranging artists in residence with local, especially with local scientists. And also at all our international conferences, we bring together artists with researchers from the humanities and natural sciences together to create a sustainable dialogue. Throughout our practice, we educate, so concentration on individual art education, a model character that takes the form of art mediation, reaching a broad international audience of different ages through different mediation formats. ranging from exhibition talks, conferences, reading lounges, children's workshops, or student talks. And we also publish artist catalogs, exhibition texts. We also have a research documents going along with our exhibitions, papers, articles, or working together with scientists on scientific publications. Okay, next, yeah. So Hackers, Makers, Thinkers is our current project, Collective Experiments in Social Fermenting. It's a project that we put together during the pandemic. It was also really wonderful to work together with Tengal Drillin, a curator from Manila. And so Regina, Tuçe, and I, and Tengal have been developing this project for about a year and a half. It's 6 artists, one from Berlin and the rest are from Southeast Asia or Latin America. And what brings them all together is an interest in actually participatory workshops and performances, so DIWO, doing it with others. So beside the exhibition, we just had a 2-day conference at the weekend in cooperation with the Weizenbaum Institute and the Einstein Center for Digital Future. Our colleagues there were Michelle Christensen and Florian Conradi, who you may know from the Politics of the Machine conference last autumn. We started off the process with a 2-day workshop with Interspecifics, a collective from Mexico City. And last week, we also had workshops by Chilean artist Constanza Pina Pardo and Rina Agravina. We're preparing for a workshop this Saturday with the Rice Brewing Sisters Club, who have been in Berlin since mid-April and have a very interesting artistic research practice. Then we'll have performances by Pei Ying Lin in conjunction with Soy Division, a local collective of artists who are originally from Indonesia but based in Berlin, and Kamak Lindsay. Also want to give a lot of thanks to our team. So Neda Remaita, Julie Garnieri, and Claudia Rao Hackett, who have really made this all possible with us, especially in the last several weeks, and are also our colleagues at the OKK Organ Kritische Kunst, and looking forward to working with the Soy Division on this. Finally, the project was made possible with a grant from the Cultural Capital Fund from Berlin and the Berlin Senate Department for Culture in Europe. So we'll start off with looking at the work of Rina Agravina, an artist from Yogyakarta in Indonesia. Jogja is kind of like the Kyoto of Java, a really vibrant city that has both a very vibrant traditional culture, but also a very interesting cutting edge culture. And this work here, Entangled Beauty, The Perfect Marriage, is a kind of a mixture of biobattery, didactic project, and an example of symbiosis. So you see here in these 3 containers, there is a tsola, a kind of a water fern that basically lives in symbiosis with Anabena, which is a cyanobacteria. And through the photosynthetic process, it creates nitrogen fuel as well as absorbing CO2. And Arena was also interested in taking this traditional form of fertilizer from rice paddies that had been displaced by commercial fertilizers in the 20th century and is only recently being rediscovered in organic rice farming, and has had a lot of interesting effects. Not only does it produce nitrogen, but the Anabena is slightly toxic to mosquito larvae, which is also something noteworthy in areas where dengue or malaria are still in existence. So Era also wanted to approach the local farmers and use a kind of a language that they would understand. So she made the installation in the form of a shrine to the Southeast Asian rice goddess, who in Java is called Dewi Sre. And this was a kind of a way of kind of reintroducing this practice through a kind of mythological or even religious component to it, and in a way that also would translate to other cultures where dairy sway is maybe known by other names like Mê Quan Khao or Phosop in Thailand, or Po Nagar in Vietnam or Cambodia. So Irina's practice is to create a kind of communities around art objects or art practices, but through hacking. So kind of using the symbiotic relation here to make a kind of a bio battery and also a kind of sound installation by sonifying the process. And I can note here that sound plays a really interesting role in Indonesia, in that a lot of experimental sound not only takes place in urban areas, but also in rural areas. So they kind of, it's something that crosses generations and traditions in this work. And maybe go on to the next. We're also showing a work by Pei-Ying Lin, a Taiwanese artist who's based in Eindhoven. This work is developed from 2018, but is still ongoing, called Virophilia. And it's several things. There's an installation, as you see here. There's a book, a Virophilia cookbook for the 22nd century. And a set of scrolls, which is ongoing and being updated, listing thousands of viruses. And what she was interested in is this idea of the virus as being something more than a traditional idea of a virus as a pathogen, but in fact, something that we have a symbiotic relation with, that our own genomes have been changed through history by viruses. And that, they are, if bacteria are overwhelming in the world, there are 10 to 100 times as many viruses. So it's kind of all around us. And this piece all really connects around a set of performances she's done, often in collaboration with local chefs. So creating a meal which relates to biology and the history of viruses, with a speculative side to it as well. So it's a meal with a performance. On the screen, you see an actress performing it, but often Pei-Ying will talk or read during the meal. And the meal is kind of curated to deal with both the idea of viruses and symptoms that come through it. We're going to have this on the 11th of June. And really interesting, is we're doing it with an artist collective that mixes sound art and food art, Soy Division, here Berlin. It's a collective of Indonesian artists based in Berlin. So we're looking very much forward to it. And I think now I will hand over to Tuçe to talk a little bit more.
Yep. Thank you, Chris. So we present Codex Virtualis, a video installation with sound by Interspecifics, an artist collective based in Mexico City. The research oriented towards the image synthesis and evolution of an open-ended taxonomic collection of new to nature speculative life forms. It can be understood as an aesthetic journey through an ecosystem of neural networks and algorithms that reflects on the role, form, and association count for changes in the natural world. The work has 4 phases, as well as a do it with others part, which is a workshop. So as Chris mentioned, the workshop is called Almost Non-Human, and on behalf of the Hackers, Makers, Thinkers, Collective Experiments in Social Fermenting Exhibition, members of the collective led a hybrid workshop in Berlin. Mauro Pebo was in Berlin, and Emmanuel Anguena, Leslie Garcia, Paloma Lopez, and Felipe Robeledo were leading the workshop virtually. The workshop took place on May 7th and 8th. During this 2-day-long workshop, participants collected samples from the Panka River, which runs through close to Art Laboratory Berlin. Based on the specimens collected, participants used AI to generate text and images to be featured in a book called The Book of Transformations. Kamek Lindsay's Holobiont Relics from the Revolution is a science fiction musical installation and performance that is an imaginary set inside a factory, extracting toxins from cyanobacteria to transform them into profitable products. Roughly 2.5 million years ago, cyanobacteria initiated the evolution of all organisms by introducing photosynthesis and oxygen into the atmosphere. The project speculates how cyanobacteria's toxicity and the anger of an intersectional working class could expand together to increase their power through symbiosis as a single ecological unit of life, or holobiont. As a continuation of Holobiont Relics from the Revolution, a performance on 7th of July will feature excerpts of compositions from Cyanotoxic Romance, a multi-species musical theater piece centered on love and relationship in times of precarity that further imagines the symbiosis between an intersectional working class, a toxic cyanobacteria, also known as blue-green algae, in the midst of revolution. Constanza Piña-Pardo's Quipu is a sound installation which recreates the ancient Inca quipu, textile prehispanic devices for recording information made of cotton and camelid fiber strings that store data coded as notes. The quipus are considered prehispanic ecological computers. These computers were made with organic materials such as stones, wool, vegetable fibers, and ceramics, seeds, and even the human body itself is part of the computer system. Fingers and toes encode, and the user's brain process the information. The importance of these computers lies in the transcendental cosmic significance and the transmitted wisdom of the native people. Pardo also makes reference with her installation to the Harvard computers, a group of women who carried out computational tasks for the Harvard Observatory between 1877 and 1919, presenting them both as precursors of technofeminism and a living distributed computer. Constanza's artistic research that began in 2013, which resulted in a textile electromagnetic sound installation, a website, an artist book, several workshops. As also we mentioned earlier, Art Laboratory Berlin hosted Constanza's workshop Keep Dialogues on 25th May 2022. Rice Brewing Sisters Club's Terrestrial Celestial is a new work that is realized during their residency in Berlin. The South Korean artist collective Rice Brewing Sisters Club, whose members are Alethea Hyung-jin, Shin-jin, Hae-min Son, and So-young Ryu, has combined artistic research with practice through a framework of social fermentation. Their concept also shaped the curatorial framework for Hackers, Makers, Thinkers exhibition. Their practice encompasses visual art, performance, creative writing, oral history, the colonial histories, geographical and geological observations, and auntie wisdom. Rice Brewing Sisters Club's Terrestrial Celestial, which is created in collaboration with urban gardeners in Berlin, is a culturing home for microorganisms collected from rice, soil, and human microbiome. After multiple stages of growing, heating up, and mixing, the microorganisms will become nuruk, a Korean fermentation starter, and sekko-otiumbi, the Korean composting method that activates indigenous microorganisms. Accompanying the installation are workshops and social micro experiments that unfold throughout the exhibition period, which explore ways to be grounded in the earth we live, while also traversing boundaries between migration, localization, and indigeneity. Art Laboratory Berlin is a research and process-oriented institution. Therefore, we are organizing conferences in our programming. This year's conference is realized in cooperation with Professor Michel Kirsten and Professor Florian Conradi from UDK Berlin, Weizenbaum Institute, TU Berlin, Einstein Center Digital Future. Two-day-long conference's first day took place in a hybrid format at Design, Transfer, and live stream via Art Laboratory Berlin's YouTube channel. The second day of the conference started at the exhibition venues, Art Laboratory Berlin and OKK, and continued as walk and talks format, where artists and researchers and participants walk by the Panca River to continue their discussion. The exhibition and public program continues until the 10th of July. And in this program, it was indeed important for us to bring women, non-binary and non-Western artists. Therefore, artists were discussing the decolonization, techno-feminism, challenging capitalist structures through do it with others manner and collectivity. So for further details of the project, you can also visit our website. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you, Christian and Tuçe. That's fantastic. I would like now to invite all the speakers to switch their cameras on, and we've got around 20 minutes for some discussion to draw out. I mean, each of you have given a really rich insight into the curatorial practices, showing a range of projects. Each of you are working in different contexts in different ways, but there are, some clear things that really kind of connect your approach to curation. And one thing that, and I've got a few questions, but yeah, people watching do put questions in the chat for us to bring into the conversation. And I'll keep an eye on that. But there's one thing that I think is commonly shared between all of you, which is the performance of experimentation. That you're curating processes and experiments in many ways rather than kind of conventional artworks. And through that, opening up artistic research to make visible and accessible those kind of hidden processes of organisms, processes of systems, technologies, and that kind of artistic and interdisciplinary research. And there are certain kind of nuances around that. So I wanted to ask you really about how you would define kind of curation, because it seems that you're curating as a creation of an ecosystem, as kind of knowledge generating ecosystem or techno ecosystem in some respects. So would you define what you do as a kind of curation of an ecosystem of knowledge in some ways? Does anybody pop your hand up if you want to respond, or just come in? Alice, you're muted. Alice, you need to unmute. Okay, there's a problem because you're unmuted, but we can't hear you. I don't know if, try again.
Yes, hello?
Yes, yeah, we can hear you now.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Technology. Yes, I what I was saying is that I would not so much think of that term, but I think you definitely can call it kind of an ecosystem of knowledges. That's certainly what we're trying to do is because I think the issue of community building is very much part of it, and creating this kind of transdisciplinary exchanges where we try to work with artists and challenge them to work together with people from other kinds of ways of doing research. So it's also a way to work together into thinking about different kind of practices and tools and languages and changing and transforming the way we actually experience and act and intervene in our environment. So, and I think that very much comes from extended curatorial practice in this sense, in extending our communities and extending our ways that we're doing things and that we're sharing things. And this is very much what we try to do in the Amsterdam Park with Machine Wilderness and all these different sites, even in a zoo, which has very contested relationships between humans, machines, technology, plants and animals, and trying to see how we can open that up into different kind of ecosystems or different kind of focuses, at least within what these ecosystems entail and what kind of relationship and complexities we can find in them. Yeah.
Fantastic. Does anyone like to follow?
Yeah, I think also this notion of ecosystems points to the space, as a location in which we all work. And I think obviously in curating museum was such a location, but it seems that now we need to get out of there and kind of extend a little bit our practice and connect to the things that are beyond the objects, or when thinking about even the objects in the museum, to think about, you know, like how they found their way to that place and so on, and to take that into account. And I think that's also important when working in the, you know, I mean, each of the projects discussed today, there is not, you know, not one kind of entry point to it, right? What is interesting is that we all share kind of this notion of symbiosis to kind of plug us in a little bit to it, and we seem to be kind of inspired by that, and want to be inspired by, you know, recognizing or looking for the relations that are symbiotic, right? And sort of thinking about what that might mean between these systems or between these objects and kind of relations that we operate in. And I think this is quite an interesting maybe change in maybe it's not a change, maybe it's just expanding that environment, right? But I think that curators, I would say, have always been interested in relations between objects and people, and how to make them public and how to kind of communicate them, but also how to engage in ways of making knowledge together.
I think maybe something that is, you know, particular to your approaches to curation is the level of engagement, and the you know, you're not presenting any kind of didactic curatorial process. It's very much about opening up space, democratizing those processes of knowledge creation through inquiry, experimentation, dialogue. And that, you know, I think some of you mentioned relinquishing control. You know, are there particular kind of relationships you have to have with, you know, ideas of control or lack of control with this particular approach?
Yeah, I think working in contexts where you are relating to other kinds of beings, it's really interesting to see that the notion of who has expertise changes, or what kinds of expertise are important. So your next door neighbor might suddenly become your expert and not your academic researcher, and or your main informant may not be a human at all. So yeah, trying to expand, as Magda said.
Thank you.
Maybe I'd like to add one thing to it, because I think to give space actually to failure, I think it's to insecurity and to not knowing is very much, I think, part of it. Like with the multi-species school, and we actually also discussed that, how much longing there also is for have a space where you can experiment, but also fail and not control things, but try things out. And I think also on a larger thing, thinking about interrogating epistemic cultures and knowledge productions, what we just talked about, I think it's very much about engaging. I think it's really trying to find a way in which we talk about embodied knowledge of different ways of knowing. It's really about investment and engagement that we make in our environment and who we engage with and what this engagement looks like. And I think that it's continuously trial and error. And it's very far removed in that sense of control, which would be something you would already know, and it's kind of static in place. But if you want to think about dynamic relations and continuous becoming and changing, is always again and again engaging something that can take you any kind of way that you might not imagine. So, and I think there's a transformative practice in that.
Yeah, I think part of our impetus already during the pandemic was looking beyond the pandemic, but also behind it. In 2019, we had an extremely vital year with a series of projects that we're building a community, especially a project called DIY Hack the Panka, which is about exploring a local urban waterway through doing it with other workshops that involve both artists, scientists, and the public, and exchanging the knowledge in that. And so it's interesting also that a lot of the visiting artists have discovered the same area. And Mauro Pebo in Interspecifics, was particularly interested in choosing that zone to explore. And it's also something we're very much looking forward to as the year goes on, kind of rebuilding these communities that had drifted apart during the pandemic.
Thank you. So the relationship, that sort of transformation and mediation between, site, field, the gallery, the laboratory in some cases. How does that? I'm trying to think. The relationship between different contexts and how you bring that into the curatorial decisions of kind of where the work takes place and how the work is manifest. Are there particular considerations to kind of where you work and how you connect different contexts and different sites?
I think the project Fermenting Data and the way it developed was very much influenced by where it was happening. So originally it started with these questions that I put on the slide, like how to make data practices common practices, so that we all use technologies and we all create data and so on, and somehow we are very kind of distant from it, and we consider it not to be something that belongs to somewhere else, right? And so that was the main focus, and the idea was to how to make that a little bit more kind of familiar, and the idea was to engage the kind of fermentation, collect data together as we do fermentation and so on. But because it was happening in the place it was happening in Gellerup in Aarhus, which is a ghetto area, we were kind of thrown into the situation, right? That we were among people who were living in these conditions of being defined in a particular way, and being subjected to huge changes in the lives that they had very little control over, and so that really influenced kind of the way we started to think about like what fermenting data is and what it might be in the exhibition. So the exhibition, as well as showing these two projects and kind of having performances, it was also kind of distributed in these, so it was shown in two parts of the city, in the west and east. Both of these areas are undertaking a major change, one because it is a ghetto, and the other because it is becoming this very kind of cultural, vibrant place, creative area. So very typical kind of Western European situation. So we were showing in these two places, and there was just a little photograph of a container where we were showing Sissel's work, because the gallery, which was artist-run place, that was lost its space and was given a different space, but couldn't move there in time because of pandemic and various other things. So we had to kind of put together this container and show her work in the container. And so we really were working with the changing conditions as they were happening. We were being fermented basically, and we had to respond to that. And additionally to that, we created this kind of sound walk in these two spaces that were creating another narrative, and connecting these various ideas that we have about data, and ideas about a smart city, and also ideas about fermenting and classifying, and telling in a very kind of poetic way this story that that on the one hand we are given this very, very clean scenario of what the smart city is, but actually it includes all these processes of people being moved around, of city changing, and so on and so forth. So we almost had no choice, but we had to kind of take that into account and work with that somehow.
And I guess the nature of being open to failure and it being experimental makes it incredibly agile, that you can pivot and adapt.
Yeah.
quite easily and be responsive to those changing circumstances.
And I think that's what is really interesting in terms of working with artistic methods, because you have to let go of things that are familiar. Every project is unfamiliar project and is unfamiliar territory. And I think it's actually quite helpful to work with that kind of assumptions and with these sort of approaches in situations like that, or when approaching any subject that we don't know.
Would others agree with that? That it's everything is unfamiliar and then kind of contestable? Is there something, maybe, I mean, you've mentioned this through the talks about what artistic research brings to this inquiry, but maybe it'd be good to kind of articulate again, what is it specifically about artistic research that opens up these possibilities for engagement, for inquiry, for this kind of knowledge generation? Does anybody want to respond to that?
For me, when I start the curatorial process, I don't consider myself a curator at all, but when the design or development of a project starts, you start looking both at skills that might be conducive to whatever you're trying to do, a place where you would try to do that. And then what I find is that it's quite easy to invite people from other backgrounds and skill sets and more sort of, or academic researchers or scientists or dancers or cooks. And as an artist, you're never a threat to them. You're never a competitor, or you're never sort of, you're kind of quite neutral in a way, or maybe even seen as kind of naive in a certain sense. And that naivety works as long as you're informed enough to ask questions that seem relevant also to them.
I've got a response to that, but I wonder if Chris or Tuçe have anything they'd like to respond to that idea of this, of the naive question, the informed but naive question.
Yeah.
I think there's a different perspective of the naivety in our project, but not in the naive in that sense, but more like a kind of a self-taught, or like a kind of a knowledge and a wisdom that has been accumulated throughout the centuries. So for us, when we were communicating and then just exploring the social fermentation concept through the lenses of Rice Brewing Sisters Club, a collective from South Korea, for us, it was an interesting opportunity to also explore this animistic knowledge and then also anti-wisdoms, as they have explained in their research. So the research is not necessarily a scientific research always in the lab, but also going to a field and then looking at more like a kind of ethnologic research, whereas in our exhibition, also a scientific research has been very well observed through Kippo dialogues or through the interspecific speculative project that is coming from scientific research, and the collaboration with the scientists that are working in NASA. And therefore, this kind of vast understanding of artistic research is layered and then multiplied in our project.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I just want to qualify something, because the fact that it's not to say that artistic research doesn't have to offer a kind of a method, but rather that it offers an opportunity to engage with the unknown in a way that, that is actually brave. I think that's, maybe if it wasn't clear earlier, then I think that's important to say. Where sometimes science perhaps would be one that is a little bit more rigid in that way.
And I think that was really clear in what you presented about speculative, the use of speculation and imagineering in bringing information and factual content in with speculation and material exploration and all these different modes of how we understand, how we engage with and understand the world, all brought together into this same space to allow us to kind of think beyond what is just in front of us. And I think that the importance of that kind of creating that speculative space was really key in all of your work. Do you have questions for each other for your practices? Because there's some networks and connections already between you, but maybe you have some questions.
Magda, what is up next for you?
Actually, I have now worked with a couple of colleagues on devising fermenting data for computer scientists. So we'll find out what comes out of that project. But fermenting is happening continuously. So yeah.
It is a continual process. I want to ask about duty of care. So, obviously any kind of curation involves logistical considerations and maintenance, but a lot of what you're curating is life, is these unstable, growing, living things. You also bring in other people into space for that kind of co-inquiry and doing it with others. So, where is the duty of care in your considerations with this kind of work?
I think, well, I've always seen it as a kind of care for the community on multiple levels. So you can say it on the human community, on the human, non-human communities, the ecosystem. And when you're creating an exhibition, it's also in the artwork that might be developing and all the complexities there. But it's also, I think, a very meditative task. I've found. I think I learned that by raising slime mold, but there's something like there are certain actions that are repetitive, and then something else new comes out of it, and then you have to go in a new direction and then learn how to care for that new direction, and also how to pass that idea of caring on to others, so that it becomes part of the community structure.
Yeah. For me, I was inspired by a book written by Sean Wilson called Research is Ceremony. And Sean Wilson is has an indigenous background, I think with the Apache. He writes about what research means in his indigenous context, where it means research is the continuous ceremony of being responsible for all your relations. So I feel closely aligned to that.
Yeah, and I think those relations are very evident between the biological and ecological, between the technological and social as well, that you're bringing those three, the biological, technological and social, very much kind of webbed together in these kind of multiple multimodal forms of engagement with the material form, processes of life, technological intervention, mediation, bringing in the social questions of how we as humans interact and connect and relate to those different systems at different scales and across species. So I'd like to take this time to thank you very, very much for your fantastic talks and the discussion. I would like to carry on talking all night, but we have to end there because it is now 7 o'clock. So thank you very much to all our speakers, and do catch the Digital Innovation Season. This is the last one, but all of the 7 talks will be available on the Central St. Martin's YouTube channel. and hopefully we'll be back next year for some more. So thank you very much.